In the early decades of the 20th century, when the world seemed to shimmer with promise and possibility, science had become humanity's guiding light, illuminating pathways to prosperity that previous generations could never have imagined. In laboratories across America, researchers worked with materials that glowed with an otherworldly luminescence, substances that seemed to hold the very essence of life itself. Radium, discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898, had captured the imagination of an entire generation. This remarkable element possessed an almost magical quality. It glowed in the dark with a soft, ethereal green light that required no external source of energy. To the scientists and entrepreneurs of the time, radium represented the future itself, a bridge between the known and the unknown, between the mundane and the miraculous. But as we settle into this story together, you'll discover how quickly wonder can transform into horror, how the very substance that promised to illuminate the world would instead cast long shadows across countless lives. The tale of the Radium Girls is one of innocence corrupted, of trust betrayed, and of young women who paid the ultimate price for humanity's march toward progress. In the quiet hours that follow, we'll walk through the workshops where these women sat day after day, their hands steady as they painted watch dials with luminous paint. We'll explore the company boardrooms where decisions were made that would seal their fate, and we'll witness the long, painful struggle for justice that would eventually transform how we understand the relationship between workers and the industries that employ them. This is not simply a story of corporate malfeasance or scientific ignorance, though both play their roles. It is a meditation on the human cost of progress, on the way hope can be weaponized, and on the extraordinary courage required to speak truth to power when your very life depends on it. As we begin this journey together, imagine yourself transported back to those early days of the 20th century, when the world seemed bright with possibility, and the future stretched out before us like an endless glowing horizon. In the beginning there was light, or rather there was the promise of light that required no flame, no electricity, no external source of energy whatsoever. Radium, this miraculous element that Marie Curie had isolated from tons of pitch-blende ore, possessed properties that seemed to defy the very laws of nature as they were understood at the time. The year was 1903, and the world was still adjusting to the implications of the Curie's discovery. Radium glowed constantly, emitting a soft green luminescence that never dimmed, never required renewal. More remarkably still, it generated its own heat. A single gram of radium could maintain a temperature several degrees above its surroundings indefinitely. To the scientific community, this was nothing short of revolutionary. To the general public, it was pure magic. The element seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to heal, to restore, to revitalize whatever it touched. But it was the commercial applications that would prove most immediately profitable. In 1914, Dr. Sabin Arnold von Sochocky, a brilliant inventor and entrepreneur, founded the Radium Luminous Materials Corporation in Orange, New Jersey.
Von Sochocki had developed a revolutionary paint formula that combined radium with zinc sulfide, creating a substance that glowed with remarkable intensity and durability. This paint, which he called undark, would prove to be both a technological breakthrough and a human tragedy. The timing of von Sochocki's invention could not have been more fortuitous. World War I had created an unprecedented demand for precision instruments that could be read in the dark. Military timepieces, aircraft instruments, and naval equipment all required luminous dials that would allow soldiers and sailors to perform their duties in complete darkness. Traditional phosphorescent paints required periodic exposure to light to maintain their glow, but radium paint glowed continuously, making it invaluable for military applications. The Radium Luminous Materials Corporation, which would later become the United States Radium Corporation, quickly established itself as the primary supplier of luminous paint for the American military. Government contracts poured in, and the company's future seemed assured. But to meet the enormous demand for precision-painted dials, the company would need workers, specifically workers with the delicate hand-eye coordination necessary to paint tiny numbers and hour markers on watch and instrument faces. The solution seemed obvious: hire young women. Throughout American industry, young women had proven themselves capable of the most intricate and detailed work. Their smaller hands, their patience, and their willingness to work for lower wages than their male counterparts made them ideal candidates for the precision work that radium dial painting required. In 1917, the company began actively recruiting young women from the surrounding communities of Orange, Newark, and the broader Essex County area. The job advertisements promised steady work, good wages, and the opportunity to contribute to the war effort. For young women in an era of limited economic opportunities, the prospect of working with this miraculous new substance while earning what was considered excellent pay proved irresistible. The factory itself was a modest brick building, unremarkable from the outside, but buzzing with activity within. The dial painting studio occupied the top floor, where long rows of tables were positioned to catch the natural light streaming through large windows. Each workstation was equipped with a small lamp, a palette of undark paint, and an array of brushes in various sizes. The atmosphere was of quiet concentration, broken only by the soft conversations of the young women as they worked. The women who answered the company's call came from diverse backgrounds, but they shared certain characteristics that made them ideal for the work. Many were recent immigrants or the daughters of immigrants, drawn by the promise of steady employment and the chance to contribute to their family's well-being. Others were young women seeking independence, eager to earn their own money and establish themselves in the working world.
Grace Fryer was among the first to be hired. At 19, she was bright, ambitious, and possessed of the steady hands that the work required. She had completed her education and was looking for employment that would allow her to use her intelligence and skill. The radium painting work seemed perfect. It required concentration, precision, and offered wages that were substantially higher than those available in other industries that employed young women. Catherine Schaub, barely 18 when she began working for the company, was drawn by the same promise of good wages and steady work. She was a serious young woman, responsible for helping to support her family, and the radium painting work offered her the financial stability she desperately needed. Like Grace, she possessed the natural dexterity that made her valuable to the company. Edith Granch, Molly Maggia, and dozens of other young women joined the growing workforce, each bringing their own hopes and dreams to the factory floor. They formed friendships, shared stories, and took pride in their work. The atmosphere in the dial painting studio was often described as almost festive, with the women chatting quietly as they worked, sharing news from home, and discussing their plans for the future. The work itself was meticulous and demanding. Each woman was assigned a quota of dials to complete each day, and the company had developed specific techniques to ensure consistency and quality. The most critical aspect of the process was the preparation of the brush. The undark paint was thick and viscous, and achieving the fine lines necessary for dial painting required a brush with a perfect point. The company had developed what they called the lip-dip paint technique. Workers were instructed to first place the brush between their lips and use their tongue and saliva to draw the bristles to a fine point. This technique, they were told, was essential for achieving the precision required for quality dial painting. After pointing the brush with their lips, workers would dip it into the radium paint and then carefully apply it to the dial. The supervisors emphasized the importance of this technique, explaining that using a rag or cloth to point the brush would waste expensive radium paint and result in inferior work. The lip-pointing method, they assured the workers, was not only more efficient, but also perfectly safe. After all, radium was being used in medical treatments and health tonics. If anything, they suggested, the small amounts of radium the women might ingest would be beneficial to their health. This assurance was not mere corporate propaganda. It reflected the genuine beliefs of the time. Radium was widely marketed as a health tonic, with products like Radithor, promising to cure everything from impotence to mental illness. Wealthy individuals paid substantial sums to drink radium-infused water and to bathe in radium-enhanced solutions. The element was promoted as a source of vitality and energy, a natural supplement that could enhance human health and longevity. The women who worked in the dial painting studio had no reason to doubt these assurances. They could see that the radium paint made their work clothes glow softly in the dark, a phenomenon that seemed more magical than threatening. Some of them began to enjoy the novelty of this effect, deliberately applying the paint to their fingernails, their teeth, and even their hair to create glowing decorations for evening outings. The work was steady and well paid, but it was also demanding. Each woman was expected to complete between 200 and 300 dials per day, depending on the complexity of the timepiece. The constant repetition of the lip-pointing technique meant that each worker ingested small amounts of radium paint dozens of times each day. Over the course of a year, a single worker might point her brush with her lips thousands of times, each time introducing additional radium into her system.
But the women had no knowledge of the cumulative effects of radium exposure. The element's radioactive properties were not yet fully understood, and the concept of radiation poisoning was largely unknown to the general public. The women worked in good faith, trusting that their employers would not expose them to harm, believing that the scientific community's enthusiasm for radium reflected its fundamental safety. The company's management shared this confidence. Dr. von Sochotsky himself genuinely believed that radium was safe for human consumption in small quantities. The medical establishment of the time supported this view, citing the apparent success of radium treatments in treating certain types of cancer. The possibility that the same properties that made radium effective against cancer cells might also damage healthy tissue was not yet fully appreciated. As the months passed, the women in the dial painting studio developed a routine that became as natural as breathing. They would arrive at work each morning, take their places at their assigned tables, and begin the methodical process of painting dial after dial. The lip-pointing technique became second nature, performed unconsciously hundreds of times each day. The work was satisfying in its precision and its contribution to the war effort, and the wages allowed many of the women to achieve a level of financial independence that would have been impossible in other industries. The social dynamics of the workplace also contributed to the women's sense of security and belonging. The dial painting studio was an almost exclusively female environment, supervised by women who had themselves performed the same work. This created a sense of camaraderie and mutual support that made the work more enjoyable and helped to build loyalty to the company. The women shared techniques for achieving the finest lines, compared their daily quotas, and celebrated each other's successes. They formed friendships that extended beyond the workplace, meeting for social activities and supporting each other through personal challenges. The radium painting work provided not only financial benefits, but also a sense of community and purpose that was especially valuable for young women in an era of limited opportunities. But beneath this surface of contentment and productivity, changes were occurring that would not become apparent for years. With each brush pointed between their lips, with each microscopic amount of radium paint ingested, the women were accumulating radioactive material in their bodies. Radium, being chemically similar to calcium, was being absorbed into their bones and tissues, where it would remain for decades, continuously emitting radiation that would gradually destroy their bodies from within. The company's executives, meanwhile, were enjoying unprecedented prosperity. Military contracts continued to pour in, and the demand for luminous dials showed no signs of diminishing. The United States Radium Corporation expanded its operations, opening additional facilities and hiring more workers. The company's stock price soared, and its executives were hailed as visionaries who had transformed a scientific curiosity into a thriving industry. Dr. von Suchotsky, despite his genuine belief in radium's safety, began to notice troubling symptoms in himself. He had worked closely with radium for years, and the constant exposure was beginning to take its toll. His hands showed signs of radiation burns, and he experienced fatigue and other symptoms that he initially attributed to overwork. But as his condition worsened, he began to suspect that prolonged exposure to radium might be more dangerous than he had initially believed. In 1921, von Suchotsky made the decision to leave the company he had founded. His departure was officially attributed to his desire to pursue other interests, but those close to him knew that his declining health was the real reason. He had begun to understand that radium, for all its miraculous properties, was not the benign substance he had once believed it to be. But this realization came too late for the women who had been faithfully painting dials for years. They continued their work, unaware that their bodies were being slowly poisoned by the very substance that had promised to bring light to the world. The lip-dip paint technique continued to be taught to new workers, and the company continued to assure its employees that radium was not only safe but beneficial to their health. The seeds of tragedy had been planted, and they were beginning to germinate in the bodies of the women who had trusted their employers to protect them. The radium that had once seemed like a miracle was revealing its true nature. But the revelation would come slowly, inexorably, and with devastating consequences for the women who had made the industry possible. As we move forward in this story, we will witness the gradual awakening of these women to the reality of their situation. We will see how their trust was betrayed, how their bodies were sacrificed for corporate profit, and how their courage in the face of unimaginable adversity would ultimately transform the relationship between workers and the industries that employ them. But for now, in these early days of the radium industry, the women continued their work in innocence, believing that they were contributing to something greater than themselves, unaware that they were participants in one of industrial history's most tragic chapters. The light that radium promised to bring to the world was beginning to cast its first shadows, and those shadows would grow longer and darker as the years passed. The year 1922 marked a turning point in the lives of the radium dial painters, though none of them recognized it at the time. The signs began subtly, as such things often do: a persistent fatigue that rest could not cure, a slight ache in the jaw that seemed to come from nowhere, a loosening of teeth that had always been perfectly sound. These symptoms appeared gradually, scattered among the workforce like seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into a terrible certainty. Molly Magia was among the first to notice something was wrong. At 24, she had been painting dials for nearly 5 years, her steady hands and quick pace making her one of the company's most valued workers. She had supported her family through her wages, taken pride in her contribution to the war effort, and found genuine satisfaction in the precision required by her work. But by the spring of 1922, Molly began to experience a persistent soreness in her jaw that seemed to worsen with each passing day. At first, she attributed the pain to a simple toothache. Such ailments were common enough, and she had no reason to suspect anything more serious. She visited her dentist, Dr. Theodore Blum, expecting a routine extraction or filling that would resolve the problem. But what Dr. Blum discovered in his examination would haunt him for years to come. Molly's jawbone was deteriorating in a way that defied medical explanation. The bone tissue appeared to be dying, crumbling away as if it were made of chalk rather than living tissue. Dr. Blum had never seen anything like it in his decades of practice. The condition was so unusual that he would later write about it in professional journals, coining the term radium jaw to describe the mysterious ailment that was beginning to appear among the dial painters.
But in 1922, the connection between Molly's condition and her work at the radium factory was not yet understood. Dr. Blum extracted several of her teeth, hoping to halt the spread of whatever was causing the bone deterioration. The extraction sites, however, refused to heal properly. Instead of the normal process of recovery, the wounds seemed to worsen, as if her body had lost its ability to repair itself. Molly's condition continued to deteriorate throughout the summer and fall of 1922. The bone loss in her jaw became so severe that entire sections of her mandible simply crumbled away. She experienced constant pain, her ability to eat was severely compromised, and her once beautiful smile became a source of embarrassment and suffering. Yet she continued to work, driven by financial necessity and the belief that her condition was an isolated medical anomaly.
The company's response to Molly's illness was one of concerned sympathy mixed with firm denial of any connection to her work. When she approached her supervisors about her condition, they expressed genuine regret for her suffering, but assured her that the radium paint could not possibly be the cause. After all, they pointed out, radium was used in medical treatments and health tonics. If anything, they suggested, the small amounts of radium she might have ingested during her work should have been beneficial to her health. This response was not entirely disingenuous. The company's executives and supervisors genuinely believed, or wanted to believe, that radium was safe for human consumption in small quantities. The medical establishment of the time supported this view, and the financial success of the company depended on maintaining confidence in the safety of their product. To acknowledge that radium might be harmful would have threatened not only their profits, but their understanding of the science that had made their success possible.
As Molly's condition worsened, other women in the factory began to notice similar symptoms. Grace Fryer, who had been one of the first workers hired by the company, began to experience persistent fatigue and joint pain. At first, she attributed these symptoms to the normal stresses of work and daily life. But as months passed, the fatigue deepened, and she began to notice that her bones ached in ways that seemed to have no explanation. Catherine Schaub, meanwhile, was developing problems with her teeth and gums. Like Molly, she initially sought treatment from local dentists, expecting routine dental care to resolve her issues. But her dentists found the same puzzling deterioration of bone tissue that Dr. Blum had observed in Molly's case. The condition seemed to resist all conventional treatments, and Catherine's oral health continued to decline despite the best efforts of her medical providers. The pattern was becoming clear to those who looked carefully, but the connection between the women's symptoms and their work remained officially unacknowledged. The company maintained its position that radium was safe, and many medical professionals of the time agreed with this assessment. The women who were becoming ill faced a double burden: the physical suffering caused by their deteriorating health, and the social isolation that came from having a condition that no one seemed able to explain or treat. Dr. Harrison Martland, a brilliant pathologist at Newark City Hospital, began to notice an unusual pattern in the patients being referred to him. Several young women, all previously healthy, were presenting with similar symptoms: anemia, bone deterioration, and a general failure of their body's repair mechanisms. What struck Dr. Martland most was that all of these women worked or had worked for the United States Radium Corporation. Dr. Martland's curiosity was piqued by the apparent clustering of these unusual cases. He began to investigate the working conditions at the radium factory, conducting interviews with current and former employees. What he discovered alarmed him. The women were routinely ingesting radium paint through the lip-pointing technique, and they had been doing so for years without any awareness of the potential dangers. The more Dr. Martland learned about the dial painting process, the more convinced he became that the women's illnesses were connected to their exposure to radium. He began to conduct careful studies of the women's blood, looking for evidence of radiation exposure. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The women who had worked as dial painters showed clear signs of radiation poisoning, their bodies slowly being destroyed by the radioactive material that had accumulated in their bones and tissues. But Dr. Martlin's findings were met with skepticism by much of the medical establishment. Radium was still widely regarded as a beneficial substance, and the idea that it could cause the kind of systematic destruction he was observing in the dial painters seemed to contradict accepted medical wisdom. The United States Radium Corporation, meanwhile, vigorously disputed Dr. Martlin's conclusions, arguing that he was drawing connections where none existed. The company's response to the growing health crisis among its workers was multifaceted and calculated. Publicly, they maintained that radium was safe, and that the women's illnesses were unrelated to their work. Privately, however, the company was beginning to take measures to protect itself from potential liability. They quietly changed their dial painting techniques, instructing new workers to use different methods that did not involve lip-pointing brushes. But they made no effort to inform current or former workers about the potential dangers they had been exposed to. The company also began to commission their own medical studies, carefully selecting physicians who were predisposed to support their position. These studies, not surprisingly, found no connection between radium exposure and the women's illnesses. The company used these findings to counter Dr. Martlin's research, creating a confusing and contradictory picture of the scientific evidence. Meanwhile, the women who had been poisoned by their work continued to suffer. Molly Magia's condition had become so severe that she could barely eat or speak. The deterioration of her jawbone was so extensive that her face had become deformed, and she lived in constant pain. Her family watched helplessly as the vibrant young woman they had known slowly wasted away, her body betraying her in ways that seemed impossible to comprehend. Grace Fryer's symptoms were progressing more slowly, but the pattern was unmistakable. Her energy levels continued to decline. Her joints ached constantly, and she began to experience problems with her teeth and gums. She had been forced to reduce her work hours, and she worried constantly about her ability to support herself as her health deteriorated. Catherine Schaub was facing similar challenges. The deterioration of her oral health had progressed to the point where eating had become difficult and painful. She had lost several teeth, and her dentists were unable to provide effective treatment for her condition. Like the other women, she was beginning to understand that her illness was not a temporary setback, but a permanent and progressive condition. The social isolation experienced by the poisoned women was perhaps as devastating as their physical symptoms. Their illnesses were mysterious and frightening, and many people in their communities began to avoid them, fearing that their conditions might be contagious. The women found themselves cut off from the social networks that had previously provided support and comfort, struggling not only with their deteriorating health, but also with the loneliness that came from being misunderstood and feared. The company's continued denial of responsibility added another layer of suffering to the women's experience. They had trusted their employers to protect them, believing that the assurances of safety they had received were based on solid scientific evidence. The gradual realization that they had been deceived, that their health had been sacrificed for corporate profit, was perhaps more devastating than the physical symptoms they were experiencing. As 1922 drew to a close, the situation at the United States Radium Corporation had become increasingly tense. The company was facing growing scrutiny from medical professionals like Dr. Martland, and the health problems among their workers were becoming more difficult to ignore. But the financial stakes were enormous, and the company remained committed to protecting its interests, regardless of the human cost. The women who had been poisoned by their work were beginning to organize, sharing information about their symptoms and comparing their experiences. They were starting to understand that their illnesses were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern of harm that had been inflicted upon them by their employer. This growing awareness would eventually lead to legal action, but for now, the women were focused on understanding what had happened to them and seeking medical treatment for their deteriorating condition. Dr. Martland continued his research, becoming increasingly convinced that the radium dial painters were victims of a new form of industrial disease. He documented their symptoms carefully, conducted detailed studies of their blood and bone marrow, and began to develop a comprehensive understanding of how radium poisoning affected the human body. His work would eventually provide the scientific foundation for the legal battles that lay ahead, but in 1922 he was still struggling to convince the medical establishment that his findings were valid. The story of the radium dial painters was entering a new phase, one in which the human cost of industrial progress would be measured not just in individual suffering, but in the broader social and legal implications of corporate responsibility. The women who had been poisoned by their work were beginning to embark on a journey that would test their courage, their determination, and their faith in the possibility of justice. But the road ahead would be long and difficult, marked by legal battles, medical challenges, and the constant struggle to be heard and believed. The radium that had once seemed like a miracle was revealing its true nature as a destroyer, and the women who had been its victims were beginning to understand that their fight for justice would be as challenging as their struggle for survival. The year 1923 brought new developments in the unfolding tragedy of the radium dial painters. Molly Maggia's condition had become so severe that she was no longer able to work. The deterioration of her jawbone had progressed to the point where large portions of her mandible had simply crumbled away, leaving her face disfigured and her ability to eat or speak severely compromised. She was in constant pain, requiring increasing amounts of medication to manage her suffering. Dr. Blum, who had been treating Molly and several other dial painters, was becoming increasingly convinced that their condition was related to their work at the radium factory. He had observed the same pattern of bone deterioration in multiple patients, all of whom had worked as dial painters. The condition was unlike anything he had seen in his medical practice, and he began to suspect that the women were suffering from a new form of occupational disease. The company's response to Dr. Blum's concerns was swift and decisive. They hired their own medical experts to examine the women and provide alternative explanations for their symptoms. These company-sponsored physicians diagnosed the women with a variety of conditions, including syphilis, suggesting that their illnesses were the result of moral failings rather than occupational exposure. This diagnosis was not only medically incorrect, but also deeply insulting to the women and their families, adding social stigma to their already considerable suffering. The suggestion that the women's illnesses were due to syphilis was particularly cruel and calculating. In the 1920s, syphilis carried enormous social stigma, and a diagnosis of this disease would have destroyed the women's reputations and made it much more difficult for them to pursue legal action against the company. The company's willingness to destroy the women's social standing in order to protect their own interests revealed the depths of their moral corruption. Grace Fryer, despite her deteriorating health, was beginning to understand that she and her fellow workers had been the victims of a systematic deception. She had trusted her employers to protect her, believing that their assurances of safety were based on legitimate scientific evidence. The realization that she had been deliberately exposed to a dangerous substance for the sake of corporate profit filled her with anger that overcame her physical weakness. Catherine Schaub was experiencing similar feelings of betrayal and anger. She had been a loyal employee, taking pride in her work and her contribution to the company's success. The discovery that her loyalty had been rewarded with poisoning and abandonment was almost more than she could bear. But like Grace, she was beginning to understand that their only hope for justice lay in collective action. The women began to meet regularly, sharing information about their symptoms and discussing their options. They realized that they were not alone in their suffering, that the company had poisoned dozens of workers while maintaining the pretense that radium was safe. This understanding gave them strength and purpose, transforming their individual struggles into a collective fight for justice. Dr. Matlin's research was beginning to attract attention from other medical professionals. His careful documentation of the women's symptoms and his systematic study of radiation poisoning were contributing to a growing understanding of the dangers posed by radioactive materials. But the medical establishment was slow to accept his findings, and the company continued to use this uncertainty to their advantage. The legal challenges facing the poisoned women were enormous. They would need to prove that their illnesses were caused by their work at the radium factory, despite the company's vigorous denials and the conflicting medical evidence. They would need to find lawyers willing to take on a powerful corporation, and they would need to sustain their legal battle despite their deteriorating health and limited financial resources. As 1923 progressed, Molly Maggia's condition continued to worsen. The radium that had accumulated in her bones was causing systematic destruction of her skeletal system. Her teeth fell out, her jaw continued to crumble, and her entire body was slowly being consumed by the radioactive material she had unknowingly ingested during her years of faithful service to the company. In September of 1922, Movin Magia died. She was only 24 years old, and her death certificate listed the cause as syphilis, a final insult from the company that had destroyed her life. Her family knew the truth, but they lacked the resources and expertise to challenge the official cause of death. Molly's death was the first officially recorded fatality among the radium dial painters, but it would not be the last. The news of Molly's death spread quickly through the community of dial painters, both current and former employees. The women who had worked alongside her understood that her fate might well be their own. The company's insistence that radium was safe rang increasingly hollow in the face of Molly's death and the deteriorating health of so many other workers. Dr. Martland examined Molly's body after her death with the permission of her family. What he found confirmed his worst fears about the effects of radium poisoning. Molly's bones were riddled with holes, eaten away by the radioactive material that had accumulated in her skeletal system. Her bone marrow, the source of her blood cells, had been destroyed, explaining the severe anemia that had plagued her final months. The examination of Molly's remains provided Dr. Martland with the definitive proof he needed to establish the connection between radium exposure and the women's illnesses. He published his findings in medical journals, providing the scientific community with clear evidence of the dangers posed by radium ingestion. But the company continued to dispute his conclusions, hiring their own experts to provide alternative explanations for Molly's death.
The women who had worked with Molly were devastated by her death, but they were also galvanized by it. They understood that Molly had died because she had been betrayed by the company that had promised to protect her. Her death transformed their struggle from a personal fight for health and compensation into a moral crusade for justice and accountability. Grace Fryer, despite her own deteriorating health, emerged as a leader among the poisoned women. She was intelligent, articulate, and possessed of a fierce determination to hold the company accountable for what they had done. She began to research legal options, looking for lawyers who would be willing to take on the United States Radium Corporation despite the enormous challenges involved. The task of finding legal representation proved to be incredibly difficult. Many lawyers were reluctant to take on a case against such a powerful corporation, especially one that involved complex medical and scientific evidence. The company had enormous resources at their disposal, and they had already demonstrated their willingness to use those resources to destroy the reputations of anyone who challenged them. But Grace persisted, driven by her understanding that justice for Molly and for all the poisoned women depended on their ability to hold the company legally accountable. She wrote letters to law firms, contacted advocacy organizations, and used every resource available to her to find someone who would be willing to fight for their cause.
Catherine Schaub, meanwhile, was dealing with her own health crisis. The deterioration of her oral health had progressed to the point where she was unable to eat solid food. Her weight was dropping rapidly, and she was experiencing the same kind of bone deterioration that had killed Molly. She knew that time was running out, both for her own health and for the possibility of achieving justice. The other women who had been poisoned by their work were facing similar challenges. Edith Granch was experiencing severe anemia and bone pain. Quinta MacDonald was losing her teeth and struggling with jaw deterioration. Albina Larice was suffering from a combination of symptoms that left her weak and unable to work. Each of these women had trusted their employer to protect them, and each had been betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. The company's response to the growing health crisis among their workers was to minimize and deny. They continued to maintain that radium was safe, that the women's illnesses were unrelated to their work, and that any suggestion otherwise was based on flawed science or personal animosity. They hired public relations firms to manage their image, commissioning studies that supported their position and discrediting research that contradicted their claims. But the evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Dr. Martlin's research was being confirmed by other medical professionals, and the pattern of illness among the dial painters was becoming impossible to explain away. The company's credibility was beginning to erode, and public opinion was starting to turn against them. The year 1924 brought new challenges and new opportunities for the poisoned women. Grace Fryer finally found a lawyer willing to take on their case, a young attorney named Raymond Berry, who was willing to fight for justice despite the enormous odds against them. Berry understood that the case would be difficult and expensive, but he was motivated by a genuine desire to hold the company accountable for their actions. The legal battle that lay ahead would test the women's courage, their determination, and their faith in the possibility of justice. They would face a well-funded and determined opponent, a skeptical legal system, and the constant challenge of pursuing their case while dealing with their own deteriorating health. But they were no longer alone in their fight, and they were no longer willing to accept the company's denials and deceptions. The radium that had once seemed like a miracle was revealing its true nature as a destroyer, and the women who had been its victims were beginning to understand that their fight for justice would be as challenging as their struggle for survival. But they were determined to ensure that Molly Maggier's death would not be in vain, and that other women would be protected from the fate that had befallen them. The stage was set for a legal battle that would transform the relationship between workers and employers, establish new standards for corporate responsibility, and provide justice for the women who had paid such a terrible price for industrial progress. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but the women were ready to fight, armed with the truth and sustained by their determination to honor the memory of those who had already fallen victim to corporate greed and scientific arrogance.
The year 1925 marked the beginning of what would become one of the most significant legal battles in American industrial history. Raymond Berry, the young lawyer who had agreed to represent Grace Fryer and her fellow poisoned workers, understood that he was taking on more than just a single corporation. He was challenging an entire system of industrial relations that had long prioritized corporate profits over worker safety. And he was doing so in an era when the legal protections for workers were minimal at best. The case that Berry was preparing to file would need to overcome numerous legal obstacles. The statute of limitations for occupational injury cases was typically quite short, and many of the women had been exposed to radium years before their symptoms became apparent.
The company would argue that too much time had passed for the women to seek legal remedy, and they would use every procedural advantage available to them to avoid facing the substance of the case. More challenging still was the need to establish causation between the women's work at the radium factory and their deteriorating health. The company had assembled a team of medical experts who were prepared to testify that radium was safe, that the women's illnesses were unrelated to their work, and that any suggestion otherwise was based on flawed science or personal bias. The women would need to counter this testimony with their own medical evidence, but finding experts willing to contradict the established medical wisdom of the time was proving to be extremely difficult. Grace Fryer, despite her own declining health, threw herself into the preparation of the case with remarkable determination. She spent countless hours working with Berry, providing detailed accounts of her work at the radium factory, her training in the lip-pointing technique, and the progression of her symptoms. She understood that her testimony would be crucial to establishing the connection between radium exposure and the women's illnesses, and she was determined to present her case as clearly and persuasively as possible. The other women who would be part of the lawsuit were facing their own challenges. Catherine Schaub's condition had deteriorated to the point where she required constant medical care. The bone deterioration in her jaw had progressed so far that eating had become excruciatingly painful, and she was rapidly losing weight. Yet she remained committed to the legal battle, understanding that their case might be the only way to prevent other women from suffering the same fate. Edith Grunch was struggling with severe anemia and bone pain that made it difficult for her to perform even basic daily activities. The radioactive material that had accumulated in her bones was systematically destroying her blood-producing bone marrow, leaving her weak and vulnerable to infection. Her doctors were unable to provide effective treatment for her condition, and she understood that time was running out for her to contribute to the legal battle. Quinta MacDonald and Albina Larice were dealing with similar symptoms, each experiencing the horrifying reality of watching their bodies slowly consume themselves from within. The radium that once seemed like a magical substance was revealing its true nature as a merciless destroyer, attacking the very foundations of their physical being with relentless precision. The women's families were also paying a heavy price for the company's negligence. Husbands were watching their wives waste away. Children were losing their mothers, and parents were witnessing the slow death of their daughters. The financial burden of medical care was enormous, and many families were facing bankruptcy as they struggled to pay for treatments that provided little relief and no cure. The emotional toll on the families was perhaps even more devastating than the financial costs. They were forced to watch helplessly as their loved ones suffered, knowing that the women's pain was the result of corporate greed and scientific arrogance. The sense of injustice was overwhelming, and many family members became passionate advocates for the legal battle, understanding that accountability was the only way to honor the suffering of their loved ones. Dr. Harrison Martland continued his research into the effects of radium poisoning, becoming increasingly convinced that the dial painters were victims of a new form of industrial disease. His studies had revealed the mechanism by which radium destroyed the human body, providing a scientific foundation for the legal case that the women were preparing to file. But his findings were still being disputed by much of the medical establishment, and the company was using this uncertainty to their advantage. The company's strategy for defending against the lawsuit was multifaceted and sophisticated. They hired the best legal talent available, assembled a team of medical experts who were prepared to dispute the connection between radium and the women's illnesses, and launched a public relations campaign designed to portray the women as opportunistic plaintiffs seeking to profit from their unfortunate medical conditions. This character assassination was particularly cruel given the women's already desperate circumstances. They were dying from radiation poisoning, facing financial ruin from medical expenses, and struggling to maintain their dignity in the face of a legal system that seemed designed to favor corporate interests over individual justice. The company's willingness to destroy their reputations in order to avoid responsibility revealed the depths of their moral corruption. The legal proceedings began in earnest in 1926, with Berry filing suit against the United States Radium Corporation on behalf of Grace Fryer and 4 other women, Catherine Schaub, Edith Granch, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Larice. The case would come to be known as the Radium Girls lawsuit, a name that would forever link these 5 women with one of the most important legal battles in American industrial history. The company's response to the lawsuit was swift and predictable. They filed numerous motions designed to delay the proceedings, challenged the women's standing to bring the suit, and argued that the statute of limitations had expired. They understood that time was on their side, as the women's health was continuing to deteriorate, and they believed that prolonging the legal battle would eventually force the women to abandon their case. But the women were more determined than the company had anticipated. Despite their declining health and limited financial resources, they refused to give up their fight for justice. They understood that their case was about more than just personal compensation. It was about establishing the principle that employers had a responsibility to protect their workers from known dangers, and that corporate profits could not justify the sacrifice of human lives. The discovery phase of the lawsuit revealed the extent of the company's knowledge about the dangers of radium exposure. Internal documents showed that company executives had been aware of the health risks associated with radium ingestion as early as 1919, yet they had continued to instruct workers to use the lip-pointing technique without warning them of the potential dangers. The company had even conducted secret studies of their workers' health, documenting the progression of their illnesses while publicly maintaining that radium was safe. Perhaps most damning was the revelation that the company had quietly changed their dial painting techniques for new workers, eliminating the lip-pointing method while continuing to deny that there was any danger associated with the practice. This evidence of the company's duplicity was crucial to the women's case, as it demonstrated that the company had knowledge of the dangers while continuing to expose their workers to harm. The medical testimony in the case was complex and hotly contested. Dr. Martland presented his research on radium poisoning, explaining how the radioactive material accumulated in the women's bones and systematically destroyed their bodies from within. He described the mechanism by which radium caused anemia, bone deterioration, and the failure of the body's repair systems, providing a scientific explanation for the women's symptoms. The company's medical experts disputed Dr. Martland's findings, arguing that the women's illnesses were caused by other factors and that any connection to radium was coincidental. They presented alternative diagnoses and suggested that the women's symptoms were the result of poor health habits, infectious diseases, or pre-existing conditions. The battle between competing medical opinions became a central focus of the trial, with the jury required to evaluate complex scientific evidence and determine which experts were more credible. The women's testimony was perhaps the most powerful element of their case. Despite their deteriorating health, they took the stand to describe their experiences at the radium factory, their training in the lip-pointing technique, and the progression of their symptoms. Their accounts were detailed, consistent, and deeply moving, providing a human face to the scientific evidence that Dr. Martland had presented. Grace Fryer's testimony was particularly compelling. She described her initial enthusiasm for the work, her trust in the company's assurances about radium safety, and her gradual realization that she had been poisoned by her employer. Her intelligence and articulate presentation made her an effective witness, and her obvious sincerity contrasted sharply with the company's portrayal of the women as opportunistic plaintiffs. Catherine Schaub's testimony was more limited due to her deteriorating health, but her physical appearance alone was powerful evidence of the effects of radium poisoning. The jury could see the damage that had been done to her jaw and teeth, and her obvious pain and weakness provided stark testimony to the reality of radiation poisoning. The trial attracted significant media attention, with newspapers across the country covering the proceedings. The story of the Radium Girls captured the public imagination, and public opinion began to turn against the United States Radium Corporation. The company's attempts to portray the women as malingerers or opportunists were undermined by the obvious severity of their conditions and the mounting scientific evidence of radium's dangers.
The legal battle was taking a heavy toll on all the women involved. The stress of the proceedings, combined with their deteriorating health, made each day a struggle for survival. They were forced to relive their experiences at the radium factory repeatedly, describing their symptoms in detail and defending their credibility against the company's attacks. The emotional burden of the trial was enormous, but they persisted, driven by their determination to achieve justice for themselves and for Molly Maggia, whose death had first alerted them to the dangers they faced. Raymond Barry proved to be an effective advocate for the women, despite the enormous challenges he faced. He was going up against some of the most experienced corporate lawyers in the country, and he was operating with limited resources compared to the company's legal team. But he was passionate about his client's cause, and he understood that their case had implications far beyond the immediate question of compensation. The company's legal strategy continued to focus on delay and denial. They filed numerous appeals, challenged every aspect of the women's case, and used every procedural mechanism available to them to prolong the proceedings. They understood that time was their ally, as the women's health was continuing to decline, and they believed that the women would eventually be forced to accept an inadequate settlement or abandon their case entirely. But the women's determination proved stronger than the company had anticipated. Despite their suffering and the enormous challenges they faced, they refused to give up their fight for justice. They understood that their case was about more than just personal compensation.
It was about establishing the principle that workers had the right to be protected from known dangers in the workplace, and that corporate profits could not justify the sacrifice of human lives. As the legal battle continued into 1927, the women's health continued to deteriorate. Catherine Schaub's condition had become so severe that she was confined to bed for much of the time. The bone deterioration in her jaw had progressed to the point where large portions of her mandible had crumbled away, leaving her face severely disfigured. She was in constant pain, requiring increasing amounts of medication to manage her suffering. Edith Granch was experiencing similar symptoms, with the added burden of severe anemia that left her weak and vulnerable to infection. The radioactive material in her bones was systematically destroying her blood-producing bone marrow, and her doctors were unable to provide effective treatment for her condition. She understood that time was running out for her to see the conclusion of the legal battle that had consumed so much of her remaining energy. Quinta MacDonald and Albina Laris were also struggling with the progressive effects of radium poisoning. Their symptoms were similar to those of the other women, but each case was unique in its particular details and progression. The radium that had accumulated in their bones was causing a slow and painful destruction of their bodies, and they were forced to watch helplessly as their health deteriorated day by day. The company's public relations campaign was becoming increasingly desperate as public opinion turned against them. They commissioned studies that purported to show that radium was safe, hired experts to dispute Dr. Martlin's findings, and launched attacks on the credibility of the women and their supporters. But the evidence of the company's negligence was becoming overwhelming, and their attempts to shift blame to the victims were increasingly seen as cruel and self-serving. The scientific community was also beginning to turn against the company. Dr. Martlin's research was being confirmed by other medical professionals, and the pattern of illness among the dial painters was becoming impossible to explain away.
The company's credibility was eroding, and their claims about radium safety were being increasingly questioned by independent experts. The year 1928 brought new developments in the legal battle. The company, facing mounting pressure from the evidence against them and the deteriorating public relations situation, began to signal their willingness to consider a settlement. They were still unwilling to admit fault or accept responsibility for the women's illnesses, but they were increasingly concerned about the potential for a large jury verdict that could set a precedent for future cases. The women and their lawyer faced a difficult decision. They could continue to fight for a complete vindication of their position, risking the possibility that they might not live to see the conclusion of the case, or they could accept a settlement that would provide some compensation for their suffering while allowing the company to avoid a formal admission of guilt. The decision was made more difficult by the women's deteriorating health. Catherine Schaub was clearly dying, and the other women were experiencing symptoms that suggested their conditions were progressively worsening. The possibility that they might not survive to see the conclusion of their case was a constant concern, and it influenced their thinking about the settlement negotiations. But the women were also concerned about the broader implications of their case. They understood that their legal battle was about more than just personal compensation.
It was about establishing important precedents for worker protection and corporate responsibility. A settlement that allowed the company to avoid admitting fault might provide them with some financial relief, but it would not achieve the broader goals of accountability and reform that had motivated their fight. The negotiations continued through the spring and summer of 1928, with both sides making various proposals and counter-proposals. The company was willing to provide financial compensation, but they insisted on language that would protect them from future lawsuits and avoid any admission of wrongdoing. The women wanted not only compensation, but also acknowledgement of the company's responsibility for their suffering. As the negotiations progressed, the women's health continued to decline. Catherine Sharp's condition had become so severe that she was rarely able to leave her bed. The pain was constant and unbearable, and she was receiving increasingly large doses of medication to manage her suffering. Her family knew that she was dying, and they were desperate to see some resolution to the legal battle that had consumed so much of her remaining time. The other women were also struggling with their deteriorating health. The radium poisoning was progressing relentlessly, attacking their bones, their blood, and their body's ability to repair itself. They were experiencing pain, fatigue, and a gradual loss of function that made each day a struggle for survival. Yet they continued to fight, driven by their determination to achieve justice for themselves and for all the other women who had been victimized by the company's negligence. The legal battle was also taking a toll on their families. The emotional stress of watching their loved ones suffer was enormous, and the financial burden of medical care was threatening to bankrupt many of the families. The women's husbands, children, and parents were also victims of the company's negligence, forced to watch helplessly as their family members slowly died from radiation poisoning.
The broader implications of the case were becoming increasingly clear to observers. The Radium Girls lawsuit was not just about 5 women who had been poisoned by their employer. It was about the fundamental question of whether workers had the right to be protected from known dangers in the workplace. The case was establishing important precedents for occupational safety and health, and it was forcing a reconsideration of the relationship between employers and employees. The scientific evidence was also having broader implications. Dr. Martlin's research on radium poisoning was contributing to a growing understanding of the dangers posed by radioactive materials. His work was helping to establish the field of radiation safety, and it was providing the scientific foundation for future regulations governing the use of radioactive substances in industry. The media coverage of the case was also having important effects. The story of the Radium Girls was capturing the public imagination, and it was generating sympathy for the women and anger at the company. The coverage was helping to educate the public about the dangers of radiation exposure, and it was contributing to a growing awareness of the need for stronger protections for workers. As 1928 drew to a close, the legal battle was approaching its climax. The settlement negotiations were continuing, but both sides remained far apart on key issues. The company was willing to provide financial compensation, but they were unwilling to admit fault or accept responsibility for the women's suffering.
The women wanted not only compensation, but also acknowledgement of the company's wrongdoing and assurance that other workers would be protected from similar harm. The women's health was continuing to deteriorate, adding urgency to the settlement negotiations. They understood that time was running out for them to see the conclusion of their case, and they were faced with the difficult decision of whether to accept an imperfect settlement or continue fighting for complete vindication of their position. The legal battle had already achieved important victories, regardless of its ultimate outcome. The case had established the principle that employers had a responsibility to protect their workers from known dangers, and it had demonstrated that corporate power could be challenged successfully by determined individuals. The women had shown extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and their fight had inspired others to stand up for their rights. But the ultimate question remained: would the women live to see justice achieved, and would their sacrifice result in meaningful reforms that would protect future generations of workers from similar harm? The answer to these questions would determine not only the legacy of the Radium Girls, but also the future of worker protection in American industry. The stage was set for the final act of this remarkable legal drama, with the women's courage and determination pitted against corporate power and institutional resistance. The outcome would have implications far beyond the immediate question of compensation for the 5 women who had brought the case. It would help to define the relationship between workers and employers for generations to come. The settlement negotiations that had begun in earnest during the summer of 1928 were marked by a profound asymmetry of power and desperation. The United States Radium Corporation, despite facing mounting evidence of their negligence and growing public condemnation, possessed virtually unlimited resources to continue their legal battle. They could afford to hire the best lawyers, commission favorable studies, and drag out the proceedings indefinitely. The women, by contrast, were fighting not only for justice, but for their very survival, as their bodies continued to deteriorate with each passing day.
By the autumn of 1928, Catherine Schaub's condition had become so severe that she was rarely conscious for more than a few hours at a time. The radium that had accumulated in her bones over her years of faithful service to the company was now systematically destroying her body from within. Her jawbone had crumbled away so extensively that eating had become impossible, and she was surviving on liquids administered through a feeding tube. The pain was constant and excruciating, requiring ever-increasing doses of morphine to provide even temporary relief. Her family gathered around her bedside, knowing that each day might be her last. They watched helplessly as the vibrant young woman they had known slowly wasted away, her body betraying her in ways that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. The injustice of her situation was almost unbearable to contemplate. She had done nothing wrong, had followed her employer's instructions faithfully, and had trusted in their assurances of safety. Yet she was dying a slow and agonizing death because of that trust. Grace Fryer, despite her own deteriorating health, remained the most active participant in the settlement negotiations. Her intelligence and determination had made her the unofficial leader of the group, and she understood better than anyone the broader implications of their case. She was not merely fighting for personal compensation. She was fighting to establish the principle that employers had a moral and legal obligation to protect their workers from known dangers. The company's negotiating position remained fundamentally unchanged throughout the autumn of 1928. They were willing to provide financial compensation to the women, but they insisted on language that would protect them from future lawsuits and avoid any admission of wrongdoing. From their perspective, the settlement was not an acknowledgement of fault, but rather a business decision designed to minimize their financial exposure and put the matter behind them. This position was morally bankrupt, but legally defensible. The company's lawyers understood that admitting fault would expose them to potentially enormous liability from other workers who had been exposed to radium. They were also concerned about the precedent that such an admission might set for other industries that used dangerous substances. From a purely business standpoint, their refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing made perfect sense, even if it was morally reprehensible. The women's lawyer, Raymond Berry, found himself in an increasingly difficult position. He wanted to achieve justice for his clients, but he also understood that they might not live to see the conclusion of a protracted legal battle. The company's strategy of delay was proving effective, as the women's health continued to deteriorate and their ability to participate in the proceedings diminished with each passing month. The question of whether to accept a settlement that did not include an admission of fault was agonizing for the women. They had sacrificed so much to pursue their case, enduring years of pain, financial hardship, and public scrutiny. The idea of accepting a settlement that allowed the company to avoid responsibility for their actions seemed like a betrayal of everything they had fought for. But the reality of their situation was becoming increasingly clear. Catherine Schaub was dying, and the other women were experiencing symptoms that suggested their conditions were progressively worsening. The possibility that they might not survive to see a complete vindication of their position was a constant concern, and it influenced their thinking about the settlement negotiations.
Dr. Harrison Martland continued to advocate for the women, understanding that their case had implications far beyond the immediate question of compensation. His research on radium poisoning had established him as the leading expert on the subject, and he was increasingly convinced that the women's sacrifice could lead to important reforms in industrial safety practices. He urged them to continue their fight, but he also understood the terrible personal cost they were paying. The scientific evidence supporting the women's case continued to mount throughout 1928. Dr. Martland's research was being confirmed by other medical professionals, and the pattern of illness among the dial painters was becoming impossible to explain away. Independent studies were demonstrating the dangers of radium ingestion, and the company's claims about the safety of their paint were being systematically demolished by rigorous scientific investigation. The company's response to this mounting evidence was to commission their own studies, carefully designed to support their position. They hired physicians who were sympathetic to their cause, funded research that was likely to produce favorable results, and continued to dispute the credibility of Dr. Martlin's findings. This strategy was effective in creating confusion and uncertainty, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of radium's dangers. The media coverage of the case was also evolving during this period. The initial sympathy for the women was being supplemented by a growing understanding of the broader implications of their case. Journalists were beginning to explore the systemic problems that had allowed the women to be poisoned, and they were asking hard questions about the responsibilities of employers and the effectiveness of existing safety regulations. Public opinion was clearly turning against the United States Radium Corporation. The company's attempts to portray the women as opportunistic plaintiffs were being rejected by a public that could see the obvious severity of their conditions. The contrast between the women's suffering and the company's prosperity was stark and morally offensive to many observers. This shift in public opinion was having practical effects on the settlement negotiations. The company was increasingly concerned about the damage to their reputation and their ability to conduct business in the future. They were also worried about the possibility of government intervention, as politicians were beginning to take notice of the case and consider the need for stronger worker protection laws. In November of 1928, the negotiations reached a critical juncture. The company made what they characterized as their final offer, a lump sum payment of $10,000 to each of the 5 women, plus additional funds to cover their medical expenses and legal costs. In return, the women would be required to sign agreements releasing the company from all future liability and agreeing not to discuss the case publicly. The offer was substantial by the standards of the time, but it came with conditions that the women found deeply troubling. The release of liability would prevent them from seeking additional compensation if their conditions worsened, and the confidentiality agreement would prevent them from speaking out about their experiences. More fundamentally, the settlement would allow the company to avoid any admission of wrongdoing, enabling them to continue their dangerous practices without acknowledging the harm they had caused.
The women faced an agonizing decision. The settlement would provide them with financial security and enable them to pay for medical care, but it would also silence them and allow the company to escape accountability. They had sacrificed so much to pursue their case, enduring years of pain and hardship to establish the principle that employers had a responsibility to protect their workers. Accepting a settlement that allowed the company to avoid responsibility seemed like a betrayal of everything they had fought for. But the reality of their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Catherine Shobe was clearly dying, and the other women were experiencing symptoms that suggested their conditions were progressively worsening. The possibility that they might not survive to see a complete vindication of their position was a constant concern, and it influenced their thinking about the settlement offer.
The decision was made more difficult by the women's families, who were also suffering from the emotional and financial burden of the prolonged legal battle. They wanted to see their loved ones receive some compensation for their suffering, but they also understood the broader implications of accepting a settlement that allowed the company to avoid responsibility. After weeks of agonizing deliberation, the women made their decision. They would accept the settlement, but they would not remain silent about their experiences. They understood that the legal battle had already achieved important victories regardless of its ultimate outcome. The case had established the principle that employers had a responsibility to protect their workers from known dangers in the workplace, and it had demonstrated that corporate power could be challenged successfully by determined individuals. The settlement was finalized in December of 1928, bringing to an end one of the most important legal battles in American industrial history. The women received their compensation, but more importantly, they had established precedents that would protect future generations of workers from similar harm. Their courage and determination had inspired others to stand up for their rights, and their sacrifice had contributed to a growing awareness of the need for stronger worker protection laws. Catherine Shobe lived for only a few months after the settlement was finalized. She died in February of 1929, at the age of 26, her body finally succumbing to the radium poisoning that had consumed her for years. Her death was a tragic reminder of the human cost of industrial progress and the price that workers had paid for corporate profits. The other women lived for varying periods after the settlement, but all of them eventually succumbed to the effects of radium poisoning. Grace Fryer survived until 1933, using her remaining years to advocate for worker safety and to educate the public about the dangers of radiation exposure. Her intelligence and determination had made her the leader of the group, and she continued to fight for reform until her death. Edith Granch, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Larice also died from complications related to radium poisoning, their bodies finally overwhelmed by the radioactive material that had accumulated in their bones and tissues. Each of their deaths was a tragedy, but their collective sacrifice had achieved something important: the establishment of the principle that workers had the right to be protected from known dangers in the workplace.
The impact of the Radium Girls case extended far beyond the immediate question of compensation for the 5 women who had brought the lawsuit. The case had established important legal precedents that would influence worker protection laws for decades to come. It had demonstrated that employers could be held accountable for the harm they caused to their workers, and it had shown that corporate power could be challenged successfully by determined individuals. The case also had important implications for the scientific understanding of radiation and its effects on human health. Dr. Martlin's research on radium poisoning had contributed to the development of the field of radiation safety, and his work had provided the scientific foundation for future regulations governing the use of radioactive substances in industry. The story of the Radium Girls became a powerful symbol of the struggle for worker rights and corporate accountability. Their courage in the face of overwhelming odds inspired others
to stand up for their rights, and their sacrifice contributed to a growing awareness of the need for stronger protections for workers. The case was studied in law schools, cited in subsequent litigation, and remembered as a landmark achievement in the fight for industrial justice. The United States Radium Corporation, despite escaping a formal admission of guilt, was profoundly changed by the case. The company was forced to implement new safety procedures, abandon the dangerous lip-pointing technique, and acknowledge the risks associated with radium exposure. The case had also damaged their reputation and their ability to conduct business, leading to a decline in their market position and eventual restructuring. The broader implications of the case for American industry were also significant. The Radium Girls lawsuit had demonstrated that workers were willing to fight for their rights, even when facing powerful corporate opponents. It had shown that the courts could be used effectively to challenge corporate negligence, and it had established important precedents for holding employers accountable for workplace hazards. The case also contributed to a growing awareness of the need for government regulation of industrial safety. The women's struggle had highlighted the inadequacy of existing protections for workers, and it had demonstrated the need for more comprehensive and effective safety regulations. This awareness would eventually lead to the creation of federal agencies dedicated to worker protection and the passage of laws designed to prevent future tragedies. The scientific legacy of the case was equally important. Dr. Martland's research on radium poisoning had established the foundation for the modern understanding of radiation and its effects on human health. His work had contributed to the development of safety standards for radioactive materials, and it had provided the scientific basis for protecting workers in industries that used such substances. The case had also highlighted the importance of independent medical research and the dangers of allowing corporate interests to influence scientific inquiry. The company's attempts to suppress or discredit Dr. Martland's findings had demonstrated the need for objective, independent research on workplace hazards, and it had shown the importance of protecting scientists from corporate pressure. The personal stories of the women who had brought the case continued to resonate long after their deaths. Their courage in the face of overwhelming odds, their determination to seek justice despite their deteriorating health, and their willingness to sacrifice their privacy and comfort for the greater good made them powerful symbols of the struggle for worker rights. Grace Fryer's intelligence and leadership had made her the face of the movement, and her story continued to inspire others long after her death. Her ability to articulate the issues at stake and her refusal to be intimidated by corporate power had made her a role model for workers facing similar challenges. Catherine Schaub's tragic death had provided a stark reminder of the human cost of industrial negligence. Her suffering and her family's grief had helped to galvanize public opinion against the company and had contributed to the growing awareness of the need for stronger worker protections.
The stories of Edith Granch, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Laris were equally important, each representing a different aspect of the struggle for justice. Their willingness to come forward despite their deteriorating health, their persistence in the face of corporate attacks on their credibility, and their ultimate sacrifice for the cause of worker safety had made them heroes in the fight for industrial justice. The case had also had important implications for the families of the women who had been poisoned. Their suffering and their advocacy had contributed to the success of the legal battle, and their continued efforts to honor the memory of their loved ones had helped to ensure that the lessons of the case were not forgotten. The broader community of radium workers had also been affected by the case. The women who had brought the lawsuit had spoken for all of the workers who had been exposed to radium, and their success had provided hope for others who were facing similar challenges. The case had established important precedents that would protect future generations of workers from similar harm. The legacy of the Radium Girls case continued to influence American law and policy for decades after the settlement was finalized. The principles established by the case were cited in subsequent litigation, incorporated into worker protection laws, and used to justify stronger government regulation of industrial safety. The case had become a landmark achievement in the fight for worker rights, and its influence extended far beyond the immediate circumstances that had given rise to it. As the 1930s dawned, the American industrial landscape was beginning to change in ways that reflected the lessons learned from the Radium Girls case. New safety regulations were being implemented, government agencies were being created to monitor workplace conditions, and employers were being held to higher standards of accountability for the welfare of their workers. The women who had brought the case had not lived to see all of these changes, but their sacrifice had made them possible. Their courage in the face of overwhelming odds, their determination to seek justice despite their deteriorating health, and their willingness to challenge corporate power had established important precedents that would protect future generations of workers. The story of the Radium Girls case had become more than just a legal case. It had become a powerful symbol of the struggle for justice in industrial America. Their legacy would continue to inspire workers, advocates, and policymakers for generations to come, ensuring that their sacrifice would not be forgotten and that their fight for justice would continue to bear fruit long after their deaths. As we reach the end of our journey through the luminous darkness of the radium era, imagine yourself standing in a modern laboratory today. The air is clean and filtered, the workers wear protective equipment, and radiation detectors monitor every corner. The transformation is complete, yet the echoes of the past remain. The story of the Radium Girls is, at its heart, a story of light and shadow, the brilliant glow of discovery casting long, dark shadows across the lives of those who made it possible. In the factories of Orange, New Jersey, and Ottawa, Illinois, young women arrived each morning with hope and purpose, their hands steady, their spirits bright. They left each evening literally glowing, their clothing, their hair, their very breath carrying traces of the element that would both illuminate and devastate their world.
Consider the profound irony that runs through this narrative like a thread of light through darkness. Radium, hailed as a miracle cure, a fountain of youth, a gift from science to humanity, became the very agent of suffering for those who worked most intimately with it. The women who painted the numbers on watch faces, who made timepieces glow in the dark so that others might see clearly, found themselves lost in a haze of illness that no one could initially understand or treat. The rhythm of their lives, the steady motion of brush to lip, lip to radium, radium to dial, became a dance with death that they performed unknowingly, day after day, year after year. Each delicate stroke of the brush was an act of precision and artistry, yet also an accumulation of poison that would settle deep in their bones, their blood, their very essence. Imagine yourself in those final courtrooms, where the surviving Radium Girls sat with their advocates, their bodies bearing the invisible scars of their labor. The legal battles they fought were not merely about compensation, they were about recognition, about the fundamental right of workers to know the dangers they faced, about the responsibility of employers to protect rather than exploit. The changes that followed their struggle ripple outward through time like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Workplace safety regulations, the right-to-know laws, the establishment of occupational health standards, these emerged from the terrible price paid by women whose names we now remember. Grace Fryer, Edith Grunch, Catherine Schaub, Quinta MacDonald, Albina Laris, and so many others whose courage in the face of suffering transformed the relationship between worker and employer forever. The scientific legacy is equally profound. The study of radiation exposure, the understanding of how radioactive materials behave in the human body, the development of protective protocols, all of this knowledge was written first in the bones and blood of the Radium Girls. Their suffering became the foundation upon which modern radiation safety was built, their sacrifice a cornerstone of nuclear medicine and atomic research. Yet, beyond the legal victories and scientific advances lies something more fundamental. A reminder of the delicate balance between progress and prudence, between the excitement of discovery and the wisdom of caution. The radium era teaches us that the most beautiful and promising innovations can carry within them the seeds of tremendous harm if we fail to approach them with appropriate respect and understanding. As you reflect on this story, consider how the glow of radium serves as a metaphor for our relationship with technology itself. Like those luminous brushes, our modern innovations carry both promise and peril. The computers we use, the medications we take, the energy we harness, all of these represent humanity's ongoing dance with discovery, our eternal effort to harness the forces of nature for our benefit while protecting ourselves from their potential dangers. The Radium Girls remind us that progress is not just about moving forward, but about moving forward thoughtfully, with consideration for those who make that progress possible. Their story illuminates the importance of questioning, of demanding transparency, of refusing to accept that some people's health and safety are acceptable casualties in the march toward advancement. In the quiet moments before sleep, as you lie in the darkness of your bedroom, you might think of those factory floors where young women once worked by the light of their own contaminated clothing, where the very air shimmered with an ethereal glow that spoke of wonders and terrors intertwined. Their legacy lives on not just in the laws that protect workers today, but in the eternal reminder that human dignity must never be sacrificed on the altar of profit or progress. The Radium Girls gave their lives, sometimes literally, always figuratively, to teach us that science without conscience is not progress at all, but a dangerous regression to an earlier, more brutal time, when human beings were seen as expendable resources rather than precious individuals deserving of protection and respect. Their story ends not with their deaths, but with their transformation into something larger, symbols of courage, agents of change, guardians of future generations. In every safety protocol followed, in every worker protected, in every question asked about the long-term consequences of our innovations, the Radium Girls live on, their luminous legacy continuing to guide us toward a more careful, more compassionate relationship with the awesome power of scientific discovery. Rest now in the knowledge that their struggle was not in vain, that their suffering gave birth to protections that continue to save lives today. In the gentle darkness of night, free from the dangerous glow that once enchanted and destroyed, we can find peace in the understanding that from their tragedy came wisdom, from their pain came progress, and from their courage came a safer world for all who follow in their footsteps. The Radium Girls shine on, not with the deadly luminescence of contaminated radium, but with the eternal light of human courage and the enduring glow of positive change. Their story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we can become sources of light for others, illuminating the path toward a better, safer future for all humanity. And in that gentle illumination, we find not just the end of their story, but the beginning of our own, responsibility to carry forward their legacy of courage, their demand for truth, and their unwavering insistence that human life and dignity must always come first, no matter how bright the promise of progress may seem.